Okay, so this is the pattern for the easy short, and I have the front here and the back, and then I have the pocket. And just know for the pocket, you're going to need to use the same pattern piece for all of the sizes. It works just fine. So for the pocket, you're going to cut 4 because there's going to be a front and a back on either side of the short. So cut 4 of these. And then for the front and the back, you're going to cut 2 of each. Now I'm going to be laying this out on the greatest stretch of the fabric. That's what these arrows are for. So I'm going to be using pink. I'm going to make a pretty pink pair of easy shorts. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use some scraps that I have of the gray to actually cut out the pockets. Now your fabric allowances on the pattern in the information only gives for one color of fabric. So just be aware that if you are going to make the pocket out of a different color, you'll have to estimate the yardage that you need, and it looks like it's about 1/4 yard. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can take 1/4 yard off of the measurement of the short pattern, because this may fit in to kind of where there's extra fabric around the short. Now I'm probably going to speed up the cutting process, but the way I'm hoping to lay this out is to kind of turn one of these upside down. Let's see if you can see all that in the, So turn this upside down, but of course these are actually in line with each other. Not in alignment, but you could maybe be able to do that, but they're actually going to be parallel. So this is going across the greatest stretch. So just really quickly, if you unfold your fabric and it's folded together over in half, right? Between the selvage, this is the curly edge where I have little tentering holes. The width of this is the way we want those arrows to be going straight across, all right? So just understand that. Now, depending on your size, on the larger sizes, you may not be able to do it this way. You may have to stagger something like this. So that's why the yardage is more on those pattern pieces, because generally these jersey knits like this are only between 54 and 60 inches wide, so it depends on the size of the pattern. And understand that this pattern is definitely oversized, and that's to give, that's what makes it kind of easy, because it's a very, the fabric is kind of over the top where it makes the fabric flow really nice, and it's kind of a nice breezy feeling. So I'm going to get to cutting this out, and after I cut this out, we'll get started with actually putting the short together. Before I get to the cutting, I just want to mention a couple of things. So 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, except the hem, which is a 1 inch hem, and then of course we have 1 inch elastic at the waist. And for the elastic, you should find those measurements on the pattern. One of the printed pages will actually have the suggested measurements. Now of course you can change those measurements to be larger or smaller. There is a lot of fabric up here to be stretched in there, so understand that if you make it smaller, your elastic is really going to be stretched out. So if you don't want to have that much fabric, go to a smaller size pattern. If you want to go ahead and add a little bit to the elastic measurement, maybe you're in between 2 of the sizes, you can certainly add up to 2 or 3 inches, but again, you won't have as much elasticization, if that's a word, for the fabric to gather. So just be aware of that. There's a couple very important notches here that you need to know about. Now I have these notches here on the center front here. You can ignore those if you want. I just put a couple notches here. This is a long seam so that you can see the difference between what the front crotch center front is from the center back, which I have a castle notch here for. So the notches for the pocket are very important. So we need to make sure that these notches are actually identified and cut out, because this is where we're actually going to be lining up our pocket to sew the pocket on to the pattern. And we're going to start, when we do that, we're actually going to start our pockets face to face, and then we'll sew between those notches to attach the pocket. So make sure that even if you don't cut these on the outside of the fabric like I'm going to do, that you make little clips here in the fabric. Now understand that if you make clips, make them only about 1/8 of an inch long, because I only give you a 1/4 inch seam allowance, okay? So now with all of that said, I can get ready to cut this out in fabric. Alright, so we're ready to work on this easy short. And I have the pattern with a pocket, but I just want to say that if you don't want to put the pocket in, then you're basically ready to go. You're just going to sew up the center front seam, the center back seam, and then you'll sew the crotch seams together and then sew the side seams together. You can then install the elastic on the waist and then do the hem, and at that point you would be done. But I'm going to show how to install the pockets on this, so we'll get started with that. One of the things that I didn't mention before is a pattern piece that I added. I decided to add just after I did the previous video for the cutting, and that's a piece of interfacing as stabilizer for the seam where we're going to sew the pocket on, and that would go here on the front. And so that's the first thing I'm going to do. So I'll explain that actually right now. So what I'm going to need to get the pocket started are my two fronts, and I need a pair of the pockets, but I don't need the back, so I'm just going to fold that up gently and kind of move that out of the way. Now for the pockets, I just need one pair, and when I say a pair, I mean one mirrored pair, because we have a left and a right. So the two pairs, there's going to be pockets that we have a front and a back. So the one pair we're actually going to sew to the front of the short, and then the other two, once we sew the pocket on the first pocket onto the front, we're actually going to sew the back of the pocket onto that pocket. So it sounds a little confusing right now, but we'll get there. So I'm just going to fold one pair and put that aside. Now the first thing that we actually need to do is we need to fuse our interfacing. Now the type of interfacing that I like to use is this Pellon EK130 Easy Knit interfacing. This is terrific for working with any kind of knits. I'm using a jersey knit with a synthetic in it, so it's actually really stretchy. The nice thing about this interfacing is that it is actually knit, and it actually has a stretch to it. I'm not going to stretch this out a lot, but it actually stabilizes the area you're sewing on, but it also has enough give to actually softly roll and fold over as you need it. So I'm using, again, it's Pellon EK130 Easy Knit interfacing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lay these out wrong sides up, because I need to actually fuse these pieces to the wrong side of the pieces, and I'm going to fuse them to both the short front and to the pocket front. So these notches here are for our pocket placement, and that's where we're going to be sewing the pocket. So this is where I'm going to be fusing these pieces, and I'm just going to center between those notches. So that's how I'm going to fuse onto the short, and then I will lay these out. Of course, I'm not going to do them on top of each other, but I just want to show you how I am planning to fuse these on. Again, we're fusing to the wrong side of the fabric. And that's where those pieces will be fused to. So I'm actually going to fuse this off camera. You don't need to see me doing any ironing or pressing right now. So once I've got that done, I'll come right back here and we'll get started with installing these pockets. Alright, so now we have the interfacing fused to the pockets and to the garment. So I'm just going to work on one of these for right now. So we're actually going to be sewing the pocket to the front, face side to face side, right? So this is the face side of one of the pockets. This is the face side of one of the fronts. I'm going to match this up here, matching the notches. Fabric is a little sticky. All right, so notches matched. I'm going to pin it in place here. I'm going to pin it at the notch. And I might do one more, but let me move this other piece out of the way. So this is how it's going to be sewn on, and we're going to sew between the notches only. And we're going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you need to mark it, you can mark it with your ruler, but we're only going to sew between the notches, which means this part up here will be loose and this bottom part here will be loose. So if you just mark the middle of where your notch is, like right where I have it pinned, stitch from here, back stitch, 1/4 inch down, and then back stitch at the end. And you're probably going to want to use a medium size stitch length. Don't use anything too tiny, otherwise it will really stretch this out even though we've stabilized it. So you're probably looking at about a 2.5 or a 3 on your machine. So let me see if I can get this pen to work. This is an erasable pen, and if I mark on here, we'll see if this works. Probably can't see that on camera, but I have drawn my line a 1/4 inch from the edge, and we'll do that on both pieces. So I will stitch that up and we'll be right back here. All right, so I brought my pressing mat in, and I actually have brought a pressing cloth in along with my iron, because for the next part of the pocket, we're gonna need to be pressing as we go. So I've stitched along here between the notches on the pocket to get it onto the front of the short, and I'll just show you what that looks like on the other side, right? And we've left the parts above and below the notches free. So it's free up here. So now what I actually kind of like to do before I do any clipping is I'm just going to give it a quick press flat just on that seam. Just quickly get some heat in there. Set those stitches. Now here, what we want to do is we want to be able to fold this over like we're folding it over to the inside. What we need to do is we actually have to clip. Remember where we started and stopped our sewing. So we want to clip perpendicular into that point. We don't want to hit the stitching, but we're going to take our scissors and we're actually just going to clip right in there, not beyond it, just up to that stitching. Okay. Then we can fold this over, and what that allows us to do is to bring these pieces out to the front so that we can sew the side seam on. We're not at that part yet. What I want to do is make sure that's clipped all the way. Is now I'm just going to actually fold this over, and before I actually turn it to the inside, I actually like to press it flat going this way. So just on the pocket, so I know that that seam is going to be nice and flat. So I'm going to take my press cloth over that, and I'm just going to give it a light press. Okay, and that makes it nice and flat. Now what we can do is we're going to fold this to the inside. And you see where we clipped, get my fingers are sticky. I can actually fold these now out to that seam. Fold both the pocket and the garment out. So now we have, looks like we have a little cutout shape. And now I'm actually going to press that flat. And get everything lying nice and flat. Okay. I have a lot of steam coming off of that iron. For some reason, let me pat this down. All right, so this is what it looks like now on the inside. And I'll just fold this over to the outside. Now, one thing I'm gonna do, I know we flipped it over here, I'm gonna take some pins, a couple of pins, and I want to I'm just going to pin the pocket in place. I'm not going to pin anywhere near this sewn part. So I just kind of like to keep the pocket flat for this because we're going to go to the other side. Let me turn this over really quick. Again, to the face side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some top stitching. And I'm actually just going to top stitch from this point a couple stitches over, and then I'm going to stitch straight down on top of this till I hit this point, and I'm going to stitch over. So I'll back stitch like a bar tack across here, 1/4 inch away from the edge, stitch all the way down, and then stitch straight across here. All right, so that's what we're gonna do. If you want to draw your stitch line, you can take an erasable. You're gonna start there, you're gonna end here, and then you'll stitch straight down 1/4 inch here. All right, so I'm gonna go over to the machine, I'm gonna stitch that down, and then we'll be right back here to add the back pocket. All right, so now I have the pocket sewn on, and you actually saw me, I have added more pins here for stabilization, and then actually on the other side, what I did is actually put pins along the stitch line, and that was just to keep everything as flat as possible while I was sewing. I didn't want it to stretch or ripple. So now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take the pins out, and I will flip it to the front, and remember I used an erasable marker. If you can see that here, I still have these markings. So I'm just going to press one more time really quickly with the press cloth to get rid of those marks. All right, those came out really good. Now I didn't leave it on there, I just used it for a little bit of warmth. So now I can turn this back over to the inside. And I'm going to grab one of the other pockets that is not fused, the matching pair to this. All right, so it should be a mirror image of that. So this is the face side. We're not gonna fuse this back at all. And now what I can do is I can match, remember this is where the notches were. So I'll match at that point the notches, and it will extend beyond where we just sewn, 1/4 inch, right? So, and it will match all the way up around the edges. And I'm gonna go ahead and pin this right on top of this, match these edges. And what I'm gonna do is now I can just overlock all the way around the outer edge of this pocket. All the way up here to the edge. And that notch matches there, and that notch matches there. Okay, we don't need to overlock up here because, let me pull this down a little bit, because we're gonna put the elastic up here and we're gonna fold the elastic down there, and it will completely be enclosed in that elastic casing. So now all I need to do is we're going to overlock around the perimeter of this pocket. And we're gonna make sure that we go all the way to the edge, but we don't sew the short. Okay. In fact, I may start here just to show you, to keep it away from that edge. Okay, so I'll just put a pin here. All right, so that's what we'll do now. Okay, so now most of the pocket is in, and the problem is now that we have, this might flap open when we're actually going to be working on the side seam, because now we're going to work with the back and we're going to put the back onto this side seam. But I want to keep this stable from flapping away, and I want to make sure that everything is even over here on this side seam. So what I think I will do is I'm just going to grab onto this, and I'm going to put a pin here that goes across here. And then also I'm going to do that here at the bottom of the pocket. And then I'm going to flip this over. And then I may need to reestablish these pins. So I'm going to make sure everything is over here. Remember, we still have a 1/4 inch seam allowance that's going to be here on this side. So just keep everything together. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to straight stitch from here 1/4 inch, about maybe a little bit less than a 1/4 inch, all the way down to where this part meets, where we've done here, because this is actually our seam allowance for up here and down here. We need to keep this open so we can get our hand into the pocket. And then this pocket area here, this 1/4 inch gets sewn on when we sew the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sew down all the layers of the pocket to this seam allowance, and all the layers of the pocket right here to this seam allowance. So everything stays flat and in its position for when we actually put the back onto this side seam before we put, because we're going to do that with the serger. Okay, so I'm going to run over and do that at the sewing machine, and I'll be right back here. Okay, so we've done that little stitching. It's keeping everything here together on both the top and the bottom of the pocket. Everything is flat. So now we can start working with the back. So we're going to find the right back piece, the correct back piece, and we're going to line it up face sides to face sides. Okay, so this is the back, this is the face side. So I'm laying this over here, matching, remember, our cutouts are the center of our notches. Laying that right on top of our front. Let's get that all lined up, sticking to each other. All right, matching all of our notches. And I'm gonna go ahead and pin here really quickly, just to keep everything where it's supposed to be. Whoops. Okay, and I'll pin right up here at the top. Now, okay, so I've got this all pinned up, the side seam, and this is the back. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to flip this over, and I'm gonna show you how to sew this. So we're gonna actually do this all on the serger, and we're gonna sew from the bottom up, or you could sew from the top depending on which side you're on. But when we sew up here, remember these stitch lines that I just sewed? This is what we're gonna keep an eye on for our needle. Make sure that our needle is gonna actually go right here to catch exactly where that pocket starts. And then once we get to here or here, depending on which direction you're sewing, you're going to want to make sure that you pull this front back a little ways so that you're only getting that pocket and the back piece. All right? You think we can handle that? So let's go over to the serger and get this all sewn up. All right, so our pocket is in, and before we flip it to have a look at what it looks like, I just want to mention I had a little problem in this area here, as you saw. I just went over it again. I think the thickness of the pocket opening kind of pushed away from the needles, so I had to just kind of work it a little bit more. Now I actually went back in and did it on the overlock, as you saw in the video, but I actually could have done it with a straight stitch machine, and actually just kind of stitched from that point up to actually cover my stitching that kept everything together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a sec. So let's go ahead and turn this to the face side. Let's open this up from the front and have a look and see what this looks like. So that looks pretty good. So this is our side seam. Let me flatten this pocket here. Fold the front over so we can see this. All right, so this is our side seam. This is the pocket opening right here, which is pretty nice. It looks really nice. Now there's one other step you could do if you want. I'm not gonna really press this hard. I don't want that line to be hard just yet, but you saw me flatten the pocket here. It goes toward the front. You could go back with your sewing machine and tack again, just up here, do a tacking stitch right at the top of the pocket opening and the bottom opening, and go all the way through the pocket. And what that will do is just give it a little bit more stability. If you're putting your hands in your pocket a lot, it's actually putting a lot of strain on the top and the bottom. So if you tack across here, it will give it a little bit more stability. The other thing you're probably going to want to do is you're probably just going to want to pin the top a part of the pocket to the garment while you're sewing with it so it doesn't flap around. We don't want to sew that into the garment because it's going to be held in there once we get the waistband sewn in there. But this is the pocket. This is what it should look like. If you have some extra stitching here showing maybe you didn't quite get over that stitching, you could go back over it just lightly with your sewing machine just to cover up that stitching over here on the inside where you missed that stitching. But otherwise, if your pocket looks like this, you're in really good shape. Okay, so now all you have to do is do the other pocket. I'm going to do that off camera. We'll be right back here to work on the center front seams. All right, so we have both pockets in and we're ready to work on putting the rest of the garment together. So this is the front, center front, and this is the center back. So we now can take the other piece, with our pocket on, and we're going to lay, this is the face side or the right side, and I'm going to lay the other piece face side or right side on top of that, matching the center front along the notches. And then I'm going to match the center back at the notch. And if you would like, I'm going to go ahead and pin along each of these front lines. And then we're going to overlock the center back, and then we'll overlock the center front, or serge the center front and serge the center back. Overlock and serger are the same thing. So we'll just pin this, and you know what, if you pin your pieces together a little over an inch away from the edge, you may not have to remove them as you sew. Get these all pinned up, and then we will go over to the serger and get these sewn up, and we'll be right back here to line up the crotch seam. All right, so now that we have the center back and the center front sewn, I'm actually going to fold it so we can see just the center front. So this is the front, and of course I'll show you the back. This is the back, but I want to see the front, because what I'm going to work on now is I'm going to work on this crotch. So this is the front crotch seam, and the back actually extends further than the front. That's why I wanted to look at the front. So this is the back, and all we need to do is match the front to the back at that center seam right down here. And I will just go ahead and pin across there. And I'll match up my hem notches and the edge of the fabric on either side. And then I will serge straight across that to close up that seam. All right, so that's our seam. We're gonna serge straight across here. Okay, so we've got this crotch seam done, and now we're actually ready for the elastic. So I'm gonna move this up a little bit out of the way, and I have already cut my elastic the desired length. So on the pattern there are suggested amounts for each size. So those amounts include the seam allowance for sewing this on. Now, if you've seen my other videos doing the swimwear, it's exactly like that. So what I'm going to do, I've cut my length of elastic, and on each of the cut ends, I'm gonna mark in 1/2 an inch. And I'm using a erasable pen to mark this. Okay, so I've got those marked. Then I'm going to wrap those around, make sure there's no twists, And I'm going to line up those lines that I drew right on top of each other to make actually a circle. So I'm going to just go ahead and pin it, and with the sewing machine now, straight stitch, I'm going to stitch right down that line to actually hold everything together to make a continuous loop for the waistband. Alright, so now that I've got my elastic sewn together in a loop, I need to divide it into 4 equal parts. So I'm going to start here, and I'm actually going to use pins. So you could use a pen, an erasable pen if you want, but just so for visual, I want to see it, so I'm going to actually just mark it with pins. There's one, and then I'll take that pin and I'll match it to my stitch line. And that on each of these ends, I'm going to put a pin. And then now my elastic is divided into 4 equal parts. So I don't really need to do that on the short because I've got a center front seam and I've got 2 side seams. And the way that I built this is that the waist amount on the front and the back is the same. So what I'm going to do is I like to start in the back. So I'm going to flip this over to the back. Right up here, the center back, I'm going to match my stitch line on the elastic up here to the edge of the fabric. And I like to pin in the direction of the sewing. So my serging, when I serge this on, I'm going to use a serger and I'm going to go this way. So I'm going to actually just follow along the waistband around, and wherever I come to a pin and the side seam, this is the side seam, now I'm going to pin that in place. And then I'm going to continue working around. I'm at the center front now. Match the pin to the center front seam. Pin that there. And then on around to the other side seam. And I'll pin that in place. Now I've got all 4 places pinned. This is what it looks like. And what you're going to do is we're going to stretch the elastic so it fits the size of the short. All right, in each section. Don't worry about grabbing the pocket. We're not worried about getting the pocket in this stitch. We're going to do that when we fold it over to actually do the zigzag. All right, so let's go over to the serger and get this attached. All right, so now we've got the elastic on. Now we need to actually turn it over to stitch it down. And I'm going to use a zigzag stitch. And I think I'm going to use a slightly wider stitch than I normally do because this is a short. I think I'm going to set it at maybe 5.5. I may go as wide as the full length, which is 6 millimeter width. So I'm going to see what the 5.5 millimeter looks like. But I'm still probably going to keep it fairly short. I usually do a 4 millimeter, but I might go up to a 4.5 millimeter just because this is a waist, and I think I can get away with having it that wide and long. So let's go ahead and turn this waistband over, and I'm here at the center front, and the easiest way to do that is I'm going to stretch it just a little bit, and then I'm going to roll it over so you can see what it should look like. Right here is the edge of the elastic. So in here we want it to be flush with this edge. So sometimes the easiest way is to like stretch it out and then roll it over and just kind of feel and then hold it with your thumb or fingers to actually pin that area. And we'll pin in just a few places. The other place we're going to want to pin is here at the pockets, because these were not, let me see if I can fold this sideways, because remember we didn't stitch these down. So now I have a pin here. I'm going to take it out and I'm going to repin it on this side. That's where it was. It's nice and flat here. I'm going to actually stretch that, and you should just be catching it under that elastic. Try to match this side seam here. Get that done first. And then I'm going to stretch this and roll that over. Hold that there. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be perfect right now, but once you're in the machine and you're sewing, you can actually readjust everything. The important thing is actually to go ahead and catch that. And the way I did that is so that we're just going to catch, that seam allowance area of the pocket. And then I'm going to come here to the center back, kind of do the same thing, roll it over, and then come to this other side seam and give it a stretch. Make sure that you're not going to get any, puckering as you sew this down. And here I actually had the pins on the correct side. And you see how far this goes up? That's the way it should be, because it really should almost hit the top of your roll. And then I'm just going to pin this right here. All right. So that nice and flat. I'm just going to go around here, and I think in the back I can do one here if I grab right here about the center, walk my fingers up and grab that. But of course you can readjust this as you sew. Just want to get a few more of these pinned. All right. So now if you have a cover stitch machine, you can of course use the cover stitch machine to do this stitch. I'm going to use a zigzag, so those who do not have a cover stitch machine can actually see how it's done with the zigzag. Again, I think I'm going to set mine at 5.5 millimeter wide and 4.5 millimeter long. So let's go over to the machine and get this sewn. Okay, so we've got our waist elastic all done. Let's turn this inside out and see, or right side out, and see what we've got. All right, so this is the front with your pockets here, and then of course the back. And what do we have left to do? All we have left to do is the hem. Now, there are a couple things you could do with the hem. Obviously, we need to overlock all the way around this if we want to. Now, if you're not into doing hems, you could actually leave it like this. It usually doesn't fray. What happens when you wash it is that the jersey knit curls up. If you choose not to hem it, what you'll want to do is come in here at the side seams and use your sewing machine and just tack this seam here so it doesn't unravel. I'm actually going to hem this. But I am not a presser. I don't like to press the hem up on a knit first. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use my erasable pen. The hem amount is 1 inch, and I'm going to put marks along here at the 1 inch line. And I'm going to do this all the way around. And then you can pin it up. I don't usually pin it. I will pin one. Turn this over and get the back done. So time-wise, pinning everything takes a lot of time. And so in the industry, they don't really pin anything. It's just everything is marked, and then they roll it up at that point and then stitch it down. So it's a lot easier, especially with knits, because knits are very stretchy and they kind of have a mind of their own, and they're difficult to work with. However, you of course can pin it up to help you, and I'll go ahead and pin this and show you. Now, of course, I don't have this overlocked. If you have a cover stitch machine, you don't really need to overlock. In fact, if I'm gonna zigzag this, I really don't need to overlock it either, but I'm going to. So I'm just gonna pin wherever I put a mark. And what I will do is I will actually just go ahead and overlock both of these and stitch them up. And I won't be coming back here to the table after I overlock to show you, because I figure you know what an overlocked edge looks like. So I will overlock this and then stitch it up, and then I will come back to the table with the finished product. I've got just a couple more pins to put in here. For those of you who want to pin things up, of course you would want to overlock it before you pin it up, and then do your zigzag stitch. I'm going to use the same zigzag stitch that I used for the waistband. I like to keep things consistent, so I was stitching at 5.5 millimeter wide and 4.5 millimeter long, and so that's what I will do with the hem. All right, so that's what it will look like when you have it pinned up. And then of course you'll just come to the inside and zigzag. Now if you're going to cover stitch, you'll be cover stitching on the top. So I will be back with the finished product. Okay, so our short is done. Basically, we've got it all hemmed up. There's just probably one thing that you're probably going to want to do is that you probably will want maybe a flatter hem. Also, remember I used erasable pen, so I want to get rid of that. So I'm just going to go ahead and prepare this to hem. I'm going to flatten this here like this in the front, and I'm going to use a press cloth. Kind of put this on here like so, and then I'm going to press down. Don't leave it on the fabric too much, and just keep checking it. So my marks are gone. Try not to get the edges. You don't really want maybe you do want creases here, I'm not sure. So I'm going to turn this over, and I'm just going to press one more time on the back, and I'll do this for both. Whoops, that's all right. And then I'll go ahead and do that for both legs. Do this other one. Doesn't need a whole lot of pressing. You don't need to leave it on. Oops, I creased here. Look at that crease. I don't know if that's gonna come out now. Maybe after the wash. And then once more on the back. And of course I'm using steam, which I probably shouldn't do, but you know, it was just on there for just a couple seconds to get rid of those marks and to flatten it a little bit. All right. And once again, here is your easy short. See if I can get this all in the frame. Your easy short with pockets.